Hi everyone, this is Germinal Van, founder of GGV Publishing Company and your host for the GGV Publishing Podcast. Today we have a great author on the platform, Professor Kurt W. Jefferson, who is the author of this wonderful, controversial, yet important book titled The Wars of Israel, Politics, Economics, and Security Before October 7, 2023 and Beyond. So this book is a 400-page book. It's pretty heavy. It is very deep. And Professor Jefferson is going to talk to us today about the motivations that drove him to write this book. He's going to guide us through the book itself, of course, but he's also going to tell us a little bit about himself, about his career, and how did he become a professor. So, Professor Jefferson, welcome to the GGV Publishing Podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you, Germinal. It's great to be with you. And I'm all I'm happy this week, given the nice successful start of the book.
Absolutely. And there is something I believe you want to mention to our audience. So what is it?
Yeah, Germinal and I have talked quite a bit about this, but I'm just delighted that this book has opened. And of course, he's the expert in publishing, but to be number one in the new releases in the War and Peace category with the largest bookseller in the world, Amazon.com, for GGV Publishing Company and for myself, I've written 5 books and never seen anything like this before. So I'm just so grateful to you, Germinal, for being my publisher, but also just the recognition. That means a lot to somebody who eats, drinks, and sleeps research and teaching and academics and also book writing, But we're also number 2 in new releases in international diplomacy. We're number 4 in the Middle Eastern politics new releases and number 10 in War and Peace in terms of bestsellers. So I'm really happy that this book has started strong and on Amazon.com and I'm getting the phone is ringing off the hook. I'm getting calls from all over the country and emails and texts and things. So it's making a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely, especially in this polarized political climate. Writing such a book, uh, I've got to say, Professor, that I deeply admire your intellectual courage. And throughout this interview, you're going to walk me through, your motivations and stuff. But why don't you start by introducing yourself for those who don't know you? Who is Professor Kurt W. Jefferson?
Well, thank you for those kind remarks, Germinal. I I'm somebody who grew up in the Midwest in the United States. I'm from the western part of Illinois, and I grew up in an academics home. My parents were business professors. I know you're an economist, and I I'm right back at you with the intellectual courage. Your works on Thomas Sowell and Mitch McConnell, who is my U.S. senator in Kentucky. Those are fantastic books that and your audience ought to know that one day I walked into one of my colleagues and she had just ordered this book on Senator McConnell, and I said, "Let me look at that a little closer." And I said, "I know the author. He's my publisher, Germinal Van." And she said, "Well, this book is fantastic, and I'm learning a lot about our U.S. senator that I had no idea about." So I want you to know that I think it takes courage to even delve into a lot of these things. But in all seriousness, I grew up in two academics homes and have spent the majority of my years on this earth in academia. And I didn't go into academics. I like to tell my students because I was so enamored with political science or history or economics or sociology. I went in because I like what universities offer a community. They offer the community intellectual things. They offer culture. They offer athletics. They offer a lot of things to our universities in America. And they're such an important part of our communities in small towns, big cities. I taught in a small town in the middle of Missouri for almost 25 years before I moved to a big city, Louisville, Kentucky. And I've really enjoyed the private higher ed space. taught for many years the kind of things I address in the book: American foreign policy, international relations, international law and organizations, Middle Eastern politics and history, European politics and history is really my area. But since I came to Spalding about almost 8 years ago, I've been doing global leadership. And so the kind of things I deal with and teach about now are how to think about leadership in global contexts. And I know you know a lot about that, being a global leader yourself in both the academic side and the publishing side. And so those are the kind of things that I'm interested in. And of course, the journey toward writing about an area that I really had only taught a few courses on, that is the Middle East. And I actually knew more about, before I wrote this book, about the Arab world and Islamic politics than I did Israel. But I sat down and said, I'm going to challenge myself and see if I can learn a little bit more about Israel and civil military relations in the Israel Defense Forces. And that's kind of how the genesis of the book and why I decided to do it. I also wanted to tell the story of the Israelis and how they fight wars and how they defend themselves. And that's kind of what led me this direction. And I realized it's going to cause some difference of opinion with people of goodwill who have honest disagreements over things. Mm-hmm. But I also felt it was important to make sure that that perspective was told.
Yes, and because I remember when you sent the manuscript, I glanced at it, I read the first few lines, and I was like, this man knows how to write. It was really the way you presented the subject, invited the reader to be curious about it, regardless of whether we agree or disagree. Personally, I don't have like a specific opinion on Israel, and I always stay away from that. I'm like, I'm the publisher, I'm here uh, to publish the book because my commitment is to intellectual diversity, is
sure.
to promote is to promote quality intellectual work. And as I personally worked on this before sending to my editors, I was in awe with the way the book was written, the way the quality of the research was undeniable. Like it was good, regardless of whether I agree with it or not. Again, I personally don't have an opinion on the subject. I always say it because like people get very emotional about
yes.
About this book, but you made some very strong argument. And on top of that, I would say that what you really went into, because and that's how I've been promoting the book. It's not a book. It's not like a commentary. It's not like a book written by Ann Coulter, right?
Right.
Yeah,
right. It's not a normative philosophical work.
Exactly. Like Ann Coulter or Dinesh D'Souza, those guys,
right?
The political commentators. Their books are very opinionated.
Exactly.
But those books sell because they're very well known across the country. But your book is a real book of research, scientific research, it's historical analysis of its empirical, its qualitative research you've done here. So that's why that's why I strongly believe that the work was going to pay off, because that's the mission of GGV Publishing, is to publish quality academic work, scientific work, regardless of opinions. Professor, why don't you tell us a little bit about your upbringing? So you say that you grew up in a household of academics, so it makes sense why you naturally follow those steps. And you love political science. I also study political science. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in the field.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I was supposed to do a PhD, but I just decided to do GGV publishing instead. But when you were in college, what was your favorite subject in political science, you would say?
Yeah, Germinal, and I appreciate your understanding and conceptualization there about the kind of, and I'm very much kind of cut out of the old social science, a detached, more objective kind of a perspective. I realize now and I see this in my own graduate students. I see there's an advocacy, a kind of focus on social justice things, and a willingness to participant observation, to your point about qualitative research. I see that. It always makes me a little squeamish as a political scientist who's like you as an economist and political scientist. I mean, social science is really about objectivity. And, I'm actually, believe it or not, most people don't read this because I've really moved into, and I'll come back to your question about my undergraduate days.
Sure.
I've moved into security studies. So that's become, in the last 10 years, I have a colleague at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, Tobias Gibson, who is an expert in security studies and national security law. And he and I edited a couple books, and we've worked very closely on things. And he's a brilliant scholar. He's also an expert on drones from a security standpoint, UAVs, and kind of the human rights elements of those. And so, and he and I don't always see eye to eye, on things ideologically, even in terms of poli-sci. But I'm kind of like you. I'm a believer that intellectual diversity is a good thing. We don't want to always have people who are, reaffirming every single thing we say in our classes or in our work or our publishing or whatever. We want to hear from different voices that are diverse and have different opinions and can look at problems in different ways. And that's kind of my mantra. But back to undergrad, I really I took a course in international relations in 1985 with an African expert. So you'd be happy to know that we had to memorize all 84, 80, 83, 84 countries, the capitals plus the countries on the African map in that course. And so I learned from Dick Herzl at Western Illinois University. I learned Africa and African political systems, and we talked about Patrice Lumumba and Julius Nyerere, and I mean, It was on and on and on.
Oh, yeah.
And it was fantastic. We also, you'll appreciate this. I learned what the word autarky meant. What status systems. You noticed in my book, I talked a lot about the economics of the Middle East, and you see patterns, but you see status systems evolve. You see socialist systems evolve, and then you see state capitalism evolve into more free market capitalism over the years, even in Israel. And so as somebody who liked international relations as an undergrad, I really loved those courses, and I really enjoyed courses on American foreign policy. I ended up going into comparative politics, which is kind of the study of, looking at trying to compare different governments. And it's an old system that used to be called comparative government back in the 30s and 40s. Poli-sci is a very American discipline that's now become global.
Yeah.
And but the comparative element to me is why one of the reasons I wrote the book. I'd always wanted to study Israel in a lot more depth, but I never felt I'd do a comparative kind of study of civil military relations and look in depth at the military force and the IDF. I thought I'd do something on Israel and go into more depth on their political party system. I studied political parties for about 20 years, and British political parties was my area, and wrote a book on Scottish politics and Irish politics and Welsh politics several years ago, and really enjoyed that. But after a while, I was really getting interested in it. I appreciated the way you framed a lot of our discussion on this book, that it is a book of geopolitical analysis. And I think Amazon, those who are doing the ranking and all that are attuned to that the book really isn't just Israel and war and military, but it's also about geopolitics. It's how does Israel fit into the jigsaw puzzle of Iran and Egypt and Lebanon and Syria and all the contours of the geopolitical faults and fissures that have evolved over the last 50 years, especially since the mullahs came to power in Tehran in 1978, 79. So in that regard, I agree with you totally that, I try to be as objective as possible, in terms of analyzing some of the vicissitudes and ups and downs of the politics of the Middle East in that book.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. Are you Jewish?
No, not at all.
That is very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I personally thought that at first you were Jew, so I could understand why you felt compelling, a little bit like Bill Ackman. Bill Ackman, you
Sure.
know, hedge fund manager, billionaire. He's a strong believer of the Jewish state, and he went on that crusade against Harvard since the war started on
Yeah. Yeah.
on October 7th. So I thought that it was a sort of a mission for you to restore that nuance, right? That nuanced approach to understand Israel. The book is very nuanced. At the end of the day, sure, you do take position. You, as a researcher, you still have to take position
Sure.
about the topic you're discussing. And in this book, of course, it does come across as you taking position for Israel. But again, the argument made are done to understand where Israel comes from. Why did they engage in those wars? It's not just like, oh yeah, let's go screw some people up today because we feel like it. No, it
Right.
wasn't.
Right.
It was never like that. It was at the end of the day, Israel has always been surrounded by states that do not want them, and
Right.
there is a strong biblical meaning attached to the wars of Israel.
Yes.
And I believe that is that biblical meaning that is still playing a significant role in the geopolitical history of Israel
Yeah.
today. So I find it very interesting the fact that you're not even Jewish, but you decide to challenge yourself and write this 400-page book about Israel. So what were in fact the motivations behind this thing?
Yeah, it is interesting. I think one of the things, I've kind of morphed in my own intellectual and personal journey on Israel over my many years of studying politics, etc. There's no doubt that my own Christian background, uh, which has had lots of vicissitudes and different things in terms of influencing my own Weltanschauung. But the reality is, what I find interesting about Israel is you have a state of folks who are founded and rooted in a state of essentially outsiders who do all they can to become insiders. And then you're having the most horrific event of the not just the 20th century, but arguably human history, the Shoah, the Holocaust from 1941 to 45, and nearly 6 million people murdered. And I'm not trying to say there aren't other, Chairman Mao killed 70 million people, 800 thousand died in Rwanda and so forth. I mean, 1994. You can go back to some horrible genocides. I'm not trying to discount any of those, but it just to see the tenacity of the people, but also to see that they were committed to creating a democratic state, a state with a commitment to justice or social justice, as the early Zionists talked about. I realize that term is controversial, but I appreciate your point about nuance. I even talked about the Jewish sects in Israel who are anti-Israel precisely because it is a Zionist state. And I mentioned that in the book, and that it's a lot more complicated in the domestic politics. And in a way, I was glad I steered away from a lot of that. I mentioned it at the end a little bit, but it's just too much to cover. It's already a 400-page book, and just talking about the military and the basic 18 wars. But in general, and it's not that I see it as a David and Goliath. I see it more that it's important that to balance some of the narratives I'm hearing in the West, in generally the mainstream media. I just felt a book, 50, 100 years from now, when children are going to read in high school or even in first few years of college about what actually transpired on October 7th. I think it's important that they get some different opinions. And the books, one of the reasons I think the book is having some is people are reflecting on it and are interested in it is there's only about 3 books in English on the wars of Israel or the army of Israel, and the last one was a third or fourth edition about 2016 that actually came out around 2002. And this book has some similarities to it. I even cite that author in this book, but it's just a very different kind of perspective. Mm-hmm. And again, I was not trying to be disrespectful to Palestinians or others in the area. I'm just trying to say the Westerners, especially Americans, need to know more about what the Israels have had to confront for the last 80 years and what they've had to deal with, and that they just want to live in peace like any other peace-loving nation that was recognized by the United Nations when they became a state. So that's kind of where I am with that.
In your opinion, why do a lot of people hate Israel? Why do you think that Israel is the source of all conflict in the Middle East? Because, as I said, Israel is perhaps the most westernized nation in the Middle East. That is the one that has a democratic system. It's perhaps one of the wealthiest nations in the Middle East, besides Saudi Arabia and the other nations. And all the neighbors who are Arabs have a problem with Israel. Like, why do you think they hate Israel so much? Is it because Israel came and stole their land? Be like, you guys get out of here. We were here. That's what the Bible said. We're the sons of Abraham, and we
Ishmael and Isaac and sure, yeah. No, I think it the modern conflict, and I won't even get into the ancient conflict, although I mean you have to look at the Jews as a people, I think, in terms of the civilizations, and I talk a little bit about that in the book. I try not to get into that in too much detail, but it is important to know that you're talking about, and I've been to the Middle East twice, and I did a fellowship over there for almost a month in 2010 in Jordan. And one of the things I came away with to answer that question first is this is the crossroads of the world. This is where, with all due respect to Africa and the 54 so countries there, where you have lots of civilizations coming through there, including colonial and imperial problems and resource appropriation and that kind of thing. But in this area, you've got the crossroads of, you've got the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and then you eventually get to the Romans at the time of Christ, and then you move forward into the Ottomans and eventually get to the British, and then finally to the Israelis, the Zionists, whatever term you want to use. And so I think I like to talk more about the modern misunderstanding or what have you, to your point, and that is really, and it came off probably in the book a little more hardcore than I probably needed to say it, but the reality is when you have that decision and the vote in November 1947 to partition Palestine in the UN in New York City, it is one that doesn't sit well with the Arabs, obviously. And the minute the vote happens, the war begins in the 1st of December in 1947. And so that's that seminal war of, the Israel-Arab War #1. So for me, that is part of why we are where we are. The Arabs could never accept it. I'm not denying 750,000 Palestinians are kicked out of the area and into contiguous countries, and that's a sore spot, obviously, with Arabs and Palestinians. But the reality is I think that is where it starts. And then I also think, the fact that the Israelis were, as the army developed, it developed from, a scattershot grouping of some crack units, the Palmach and others, and then into the Haganah, the underground army. And then eventually, May 26, 1948, just a few days after the country becomes a state by their own declaration, you've got the IDF coming on board. But the real issue for me is David Ben-Gurion, while in his premierships, and he had a couple premierships, in his premierships and running the country as prime minister, he really reminds the world, not just the Israelis, but the world, that this is a country that is going to make sure everybody in the world remembers what was done to the Jews during the Holocaust. And that's why they go and the Mossad abducts Adolf Eichmann. He puts him on trial to teach a generation of native-born Jews, the Sabras, what their forebears and what their comrades, the fellow Jews from Europe, went through, and why they couldn't defend themselves. They were fighting the Wehrmacht, and the Nazis, the German war machine. They couldn't stand up to them. They were disarmed, and essentially that's where he says never again. And that's one of the things I think where the rest of the world sees Israel with a chip on its shoulder and says, oh, they're going to defend to the last person. And I'm not trying to glorify that. I'm an American. I don't have a dog in this fight. And so I'm just trying to say, hey, you have to respect and understand that they're concerned about their territory and their people. And then one last thing I'll say that I said on an interview this morning on the radio about the book, and that is essentially people forget, and a lot of people talking about, oh, this is all Jews are Europeans. It's colonialism and white person's religion and all this. They forget that 40 to 50% of Israeli Jews are what we call Mizrahi Jews. Mm-hmm. They're Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. They're persons of color who many of their parents were Arab, and their forefathers 500 years ago converted to Judaism. So they're not a bunch of white colonial European settlers. There's a much bigger group being born in Israel and having come in from Israel. The first Aliyah in the early 50s came from Yemen, where all the Houthis and all that's going on now. These were Jews of color. They were not Jews that look like me. Many look like you. So I mean, it's a very interesting thing to think about, the multiculturalism of the country in that regard. I just thought I wanted to throw that out because that's another point I make in the book, just obscurely.
Do you care to explain what Zionism is?
Yeah.
Before you explain, the reason is because a lot of people confuse anti-Semitism with Zionism. If, for example, I say, I don't support Israel, people say, oh, you're anti-Semitic. But Semitism comes from Isaac and Ismail, right? So Arabs,
exactly.
So Arabs are also Semites.
Yep.
But today, when someone say, "Oh yeah, I'm against the state of Israel," oh, you're anti-Semite, but that's not correct. I think it's more correct to say I'm anti-Zionist than anti-Semite. I have no problem with Semites. I have a problem with the concept of Zionism. When I say I, it's not me personally. I'm speaking in person.
Yeah.
But I think, like, since technically you're now an expert on this because your book is #1 release. You wrote a 400-page book on the wars of Israel. People will come at you now for being an expert in explaining Jewish culture. So. Sure. So how would you explain Zionism to the average guy like me who doesn't know what Zionism is?
Well, I think you make a very good distinction and conceptualization on the term of, Semitism vis-a-vis the general derogatory term in the West, especially in the United States. We'll say that on anti-Semitism. And, I've grappled with this for many, many years. I wrote a chapter in my first book on Christianity and world politics about Arab-Israeli issues and the conflict. I even quoted it some of it in the book. But you're absolutely right. The Semites historically are, Arabs and Jews coming from essentially the same ethnic background, the same context in the Middle East. and you can go into a lot more detail on Ishmael and Islam and coming out of Arabia and the Prophet Muhammad and so forth. And I tried not to steer too far that direction in the book because I didn't want people, I'm sure some will think that I'm attacking Islam. I'm not attacking Islam at all. These are political concepts that tie to Islamic
Yeah.
regimes. And there are liberals and others in every regime. There are moderate Muslims, and at the end I kind of talked about that. That really in the Arab world you have intra-Islamic and Islamist and Islamic battles going on between. You're seeing it in Syria right now. You've got moderate Muslims and more Islamist Muslims and others in political context with al-Sharaa and the HTS coming to power there in December and so forth. But back to your point. So for me, Zionism, and I'll come back to anti-Semitism, Zionism is the quest for a Jewish national home in Palestine. It's pretty straightforward. I talk in the chronology right off the bat in the book. It's one of the reasons I did a chronology, is people could kind of see the evolution of the concept of Zionism, and talked a lot about Dreyfus, not Dreyfus. I did talk about Dreyfus, yeah. But the progenitor of the concept and the writer of the Jewish state, and Dr. Theodor Herzl, and the idea that they had the World Zionist Congress in 1897 and really put a emphasis, many of the European Jews, on, hey, let's get back, led by Herzl, let's get back to, or let's move to, they hadn't been there, they'd been there, but they hadn't grown up there. Let's move to Palestine and just have a Jewish national home. And so you then get into the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the year prior, the Sykes-Picot secret agreement that carved up the Middle East in the middle of the First World War, geopolitically. But the interesting thing about Zionism is that then this is ensconced in the British policy, and I like to throw the British under the bus, politically, usually here. Very American thing to do, given that we ejected the British from our own territory, yeah, and in terms of revolutionary politics. But the reality is the British were good at telling both the Arabs and the Jews what they wanted to hear. And Winston Churchill, as one of the colonial secretary during the First World War, was very good at saying, one thing. So what they did was they, basically told the world they were pro-Jewish and pro-Zionist, but they told the domestic folks in Palestine they were pro-Arab. And so they would go back and forth. And that was the policy, this kind of catatonic back and forth from about 1920 all the way till we run into a insurrection, 1936 to 39, the Arab Rebellion. And then World War II hits, and that changes a lot. And I talk a little bit about that in the book. But then eventually the Civil War, or as I call it, the War of Liberation for the Israelis, but it was also just the first, Arab-Israeli war, hits in late 1947, early 1948. Now back to anti-Semitism, and let me just make this point, and then I'll stop. And that is, you're right. This is a concept that gets thrown in a way at those who are criticizing Israel, I think, and many times unfairly, because to say that you can criticize Israelis is the same thing as criticizing their ethnicity or their religion, would be akin to saying we're going to criticize Americans and then us say, well, you're criticizing me because of my religion or because of my trade or because of something else. And I think we have to be very careful about that. I think there are a lot of Israelis and Jews who would argue the same thing. Yeah. But I also tried to deal with this. You would probably disagree with me in the book, in that I called a lot of the kind of things I'm seeing on college campuses and all that anti-Semitism. And I feel the problem I have with it is that it goes to a point that is saying things like, let's just get rid of Jewish students, or let's just get rid of the Jews. That to me, when you cross that line, it's one thing to say you're wrong, Israel, but it's also another thing to say, we need to kill all Israelis or kill the Jews because of who they are. And I think we would all agree on that. But your point is well taken. It's a fine line that you can go from intellectual integrity to intellectual dishonesty
Yeah.
pretty quick in some ways.
I think the hatred that most people have toward the Jews over the centuries is purely based on jealousy and envy. In my opinion, first of all, we never really seen Jews in agriculture for a reason. Many uh, countries, they pass laws to prevent Jews to own land because back in the days, land ownership was the ultimate symbol of wealth. And Jewish people have this absolute power to turn obstacles into opportunities.
Yes.
They fascinate me to this extent. Like they were secluded socially, saying you guys cannot own this. They say, okay, instead of crying about it, they say, okay, you know what? Why don't we get together and master capitalism? So they got into finance. They start mastering banking, and when banking at the start, when banking became a thing, people used to see bankers as second-class citizens. Like it was not a good thing to be a banker. But today, when you're a banker, you're one of the wealthiest people in society. Because
Yes.
you own a bank, because the bank is the one that creates, I wouldn't say creates credit, the central bank creates credit, but the bank is the one that makes money one way or another through interest rates. Like they loan you money even when you put money in the bank in a bank account, the money the bank still makes money off you. So the banks has a way to make money. So Jewish people understood how capitalism works, how the financial system works. And Jewish people always engage in intellectual activities. That's why they're the one collecting Nobel Prize like it's nothing.
Right.
And
Right.
and seeing that, it makes people bitter, resentful. Like
Right.
why every time these guys do something, it works for them.
Right.
But it's not rocket science. And I always say, and that's why I always admire Jewish culture is that they engage in intellectual activities. You never see Jewish in sports, in entertainment. Sure, they even in when it comes to entertainment, especially in America, they own entertainment companies, but
Sure.
they're not the one. Uh, they're not in like in the entertainment industry as like dominating the industry. They dominate finance. They're the one that manage risk capital, hedge fund managers, private equity managers, debt funds, banks. Those guys are the ones that master the money. And that's why they're so wealthy. And people don't understand. They say maybe if you guys understand how money works, you see that what Jewish people are doing is not rocket science at all. And
Yeah.
that and that's how they were able to manage. And that's when you look at the Rothschild family in Europe.
Sure.
I met Rothschild. He was a Jewish guy. He started a bank in Frankfurt, I believe, and
Mm-hmm.
then he inculcated that intellectual, uh, that desire for intellectual pursuit through banking into his kids, and then they spread all over Europe. In Napoli, in Paris, in London, and so on
Yeah.
and so forth. So
It, it's a very interesting discussion and set of insights that kind of I mean, like an intellectual history that you've just kind of given on the genius of the Jewish mind and Jewish culture and all that. And one of the things I would say, I had a good colleague at my last institution in Missouri who taught courses on Jewish history, and we talked a lot because he knew I was interested in Israel. This is going back 20 years, and he knew I had some interest in their military and their politics. But he said, "Look, Kurt, if you go back to the Jews in Europe and the persecution that they endured for 1,000+ years, to your point, Germinal, they were in areas like education, but then they were discriminated against and kicked out. So then they moved into publishing. They were discriminated, kicked out. Then they moved into social services, discriminated, persecuted. And this was back when you didn't have a formal state. This was when the monarchy was controlling the affairs of countries, and a nation was based off who the monarch was prior to kind of the Peace of Westphalia kind of time. And so the Jews, just like to your point, were adaptable, malleable. They were able to find their way into the next thing that they could do. And eventually, as you're seeing in the West and even in other parts of the world, they become really, really good at everything. And so because they've had the experiences. But I also want to say that's within a context of pretty much ongoing persecution, and also having to be on the run, having to move from country to country. One of the points that, I think is important about Israel is that there used to be Jews scattered throughout all the Middle East and North Africa. And those communities, as you start to see 1978, 79 come forward, then the Gulf Wars, the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 88. I didn't talk much about that war in the book, but you get to 91 and to our age, you used to have, not big communities, but 15,000 Jews in Tunisia and 50,000 Jews in Egypt and so forth. Those communities have dwindled to 10, 15, 30, and they've all made Aliyah back to Israel, or they've moved to the West. They've come to the United States, or they've gone to London or somewhere like that.
Now I'd like to move to a different topic, and this topic is about writing. So at the end of the day, you're an author, you're a writer, and I always ask this question to all my guests who come on the GGV Publishing Podcast. What is your writing strategy? What is your approach to writing? So you wrote this 400-page book. What was your approach? What method did you use to complete this project?
Well, I think writing is important.
What is your writing philosophy as well?
And I think my writing philosophy is more instrumental than it is, like kind of metaphysical. It's more, my dad always said, and he was a marketing professor, and my mom was a business communication professor. My dad always said, Kurt, you're right to inform, not to impress. And I remember that always stuck with me. I had him review one of my papers one time when I was a freshman in college, and he took a look at it, and he was like, and he's a very mild-mannered professor. I mean, even more mild-mannered than me, and very good guy, very easygoing. And he just looked at it and said, "This isn't very good." And he handed it back to me and said, "You need to start working on rewrites." And of course that hurt my feelings at first, but then as I got deeper into it, what he was trying to say is, if you want to do something right, you've got to put some effort into it. Yeah. You've got to work at it. This doesn't come naturally. I look back at some of my early writings, including my first couple books. I look at my dissertation. I look at my master's paper. Some of that stuff I wouldn't even accept now. I would not say it was good writing, but writing is one of these things, and I'm a firm believer, the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Absolutely.
And I tell my students that, one of the things I do, and then I'll talk a little bit about the book and my strategy. Sure. I pull out a journal article that I wrote years ago on Czechoslovak party systems, back when Czechs and Slovaks were still together before 1993. And I have them read about a half-page run-on sentence. And I give it to my students, and they look at it and they say, "This is terrible, Dr. Jefferson." I said, "Yeah, you're right. And I got it published too." So even bad writing can get published. I want people to know that, but I also know that I can always improve. But my strategy is to find a big question that I want to answer. And then I'm an outliner. So I like to outline, what is this book going to look like? What are the themes, the topics? And then within those themes and topics, what are the sub themes and subtopics? And I generally start with a pretty big outline that I think about for 3 or 4 months, and add things, subtract things, and then it's about 2 pages, but it's been poured over and all that. And that's all before I even start thinking about, okay, I need 8 books on this to sit out here while I'm typing. And I used my first 2 or 3 books I wrote all by hand. Even though I've always been a typist, I sat by the pool with my kids, and I would write on yellow legal pads for 4 years. And of course, I was teaching classes, so I couldn't do a lot during the academic year, but I do it in the summer. But now, having computer in front of you, you can open up books and get right at it. And actually, this book took me less time than any book I've ever written. It took me, I think, 6 or 7 months from the
Oh,
time
wow.
you and I kind of met, and I was on my way a little bit at that point. But I was just really into it. I really loved learning about the histories and the ideas of behind the IDF's work, and of course the geopolitics. Which the geopolitics, I've taught this for years. I knew a lot. I already knew how to lay some of that out, and I just then would pull books that I needed for the references. But like you said, this book has 235, 240, somewhere in that range references, and most are primary sources. I do have a lot of secondary sources too, but I think it's a pretty well researched book, and I think
Mhm.
it does achieve what I set out to do in the book.
How would you describe, before I ask my question, I wanted to say this comment like, I also have a outline. I cannot write a book without an outline. To
Exactly.
me, it's like it's like a business plan. You need to have a business plan in order to start a business. Even if the business in itself may seem simple, that to the point that you don't even feel the need to sit down and create like a PowerPoint presentation, you always need a plan. And that's how the outline comes to me. I always start with an abstract, then I write the outline, introduction, part one, chapter one, chapter two, and then so on and so forth. That's even before I get into the research material I'm going to use. But my question is, in your opinion, what makes a writer a good writer? Like, what makes him uh, even a great writer? Like, in your opinion, because you write, so you publish a number one release on Amazon, which is on the way to become a best-selling book. So, what makes you a good writer, Kurt?
I think a writer has to one have be passionate about their writing. I oversee as a grad dean graduate writing program. I'm not the one writing overseeing it. We have actually the new poet laureate of the state of Kentucky, Kathleen Driscoll, is our leader of the program, and she's fabulous and a masterful poet. But she's passionate about her writing. Everything she does, she's passionate about. And I've watched colleagues like her; they make me passionate about what I do. And so in writing, if you're not passionate, um, I think it's going to be hard to get excited about a project. That's number one. I think two, you have to, as I said before, you got to have something to say. I mean,
Yeah.
you can't just go in and say, "Oh, I'm writing this because my professor told me to do it, or my better half told me to do it." You have to know exactly what you're going to say. And I tell this to students when they're doing graduate work, and even back when I had undergraduate students, I tell them you're constantly in a state of refining and narrowing when you write. You think that it's hard to get 100 pages onto you know into a mini book or a book or whatever, but when you start to really peel back the onion on a given topic, I mean, anti-Semitism. If we were to sit and write about anti-Semitism for the next 20 minutes, we could probably each write 10 pages just based on things we've read in the last 3 weeks on, the 2 people assassinated in Washington, D.C., the sadness evoked from the Qatari delegation working with Trump and Witkoff, the history of the Shoah, the Holocaust. We could just go on and on and on. And when people start to realize, oh, yeah, you could literally write a 150-page book,
Okay.
on something as direct and simple as just Zionism, anti-Semitism, the military and politics. We take, an African example, 1962 in the Belgian Congo, the first time that the UN went on the offensive against the Congo forces, and doing it, Operation Grand Slam or whatever it was called. And the UN was not a defensive peacekeeping force at that time. You could do that. You could do Charles de Gaulle and the Force de Frappe, and then the IDF under Moshe Dayan. That could be a 150-page book that one could write within a year if they really wanted to do it. So you've got to do that. And then I think the other thing that's important is I think it's important to, if possible, once you write a little bit, make sure you're talking to other people so you can flesh out ideas that,
Yeah.
does this sound right? Does this sound logical? Am I doing the right thing? I appreciated you. You've been really one of my closest sounding boards in this project as my publisher. Because one, you're a political scientist and an economist, so we're from the same tribe, and we also are social scientists. So our brains think alike in terms of organization, scientifically. We talk about causation and things like that from an economic and political perspective. So if I didn't have you to bounce a few of these ideas off of, it would not be as easy. It wasn't an easy project, but it would not be as fruitful.
Yeah.
And then I had a few other people who study, military history and politics and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's to me, a good writer is someone who writes every day. I do that. I write a lot, and it's my craft. And I think when you have a craft, you have to be obsessed with it. You have to be the best at it. And the only way to be the best at your craft, no matter what your craft is to practice it every single day.
Indeed.
And I write every single day. There is a book that I've been working on for the past few months. It's called The Death of the Middle Class: How Cronyism Destroyed the American Dream. So
fantastic.
Yeah, so I'm planning on publishing that perhaps in July. And I'm currently on the chapter about how Donald Trump was able to win over the middle class, the American middle class, because when you look at Donald Trump and when you look at the middle class, there's a big disconnect. The guy is a billionaire. He never lived the middle class lifestyle. He grew up in material opulence. He's extremely wealthy. And yet, for some reason, a lot of people in the middle class see themselves in him. They see themselves. They see him as the embodiment of the American dream. He's this tall, white, charismatic political leader, and he's wealthy, he's very rich. So people feel like, if he did it, I can do it. And it's true. Like, the way he did it, it's not impossible. Sure, he comes from a privileged family, that helps. But to me, there's no guarantee that because you come from a privileged family, therefore you're set. At the end of the day, if you do not produce, you're not going to make it. So, to me, a good writer, like, it's someone who writes every day, who flesh out ideas, who talks to people about what he's working on so that they can give feedback. But especially people who are also in the same field as him or her. So, because a lot of people have opinions without the evidence to back their opinions. What I mean is, everyone can say what they want, but you only take advice from people who have done it before you.
Exactly.
So in order to be a good writer, you want to talk to a writer who has published books, who have even won awards, or he's even a best-selling author, because he knows or she knows what it takes to reach that level of success. So, so that's how I see being a good writer, or even being a great writer. Because some people, they just read, but they never write. And they can give you opinions about how they feel, but I appreciate your opinion, but I'm not going to take it if you haven't done it yourself.
Yeah. And if I could also add to that wonderful kind of soliloquy on why we need to care about writing and why it's important is I think everybody knows in America that, one of the things as dean, I always lecture my colleagues on the folks who report to me, and they're faculty, they're accomplished in their fields. But I tell them, I'm at core a liberal arts person at the core. I believe in the humanities, the humanistic idea of understanding. But I'm like you, I'm a social scientist. I want to see empirical evidence. I want to see provable things and so forth. But the reality is, we live in a culture in the West today that has kind of rejected intellectual things and is
Absolutely.
really attacking um, the kind of things that you're talking about. We've lost the ability to reflect as individuals in a culture, and there's no better way. And I tell my doctoral students this: there's no better way to kind of understand where you are than by reflecting. And when you have writing is the ultimate uh, discipline of reflection. And
Absolutely.
you can tell yourself a lot about yourself. You can tell yourself a lot. You learn about others and cultures and everything else. And until you can put it to paper and make
Yeah.
sense of it, you're not really, I mean, I'm not saying you're not an educated individual. I'm just saying that your education will be incomplete without having been able to do that and try to work at it. And it's kind of like Trump. You're talking about him as a kind of a Theodore Rooseveltian populist. I mean, he's trying to get people to believe in the country again in terms of why the working classes and middle classes don't have to give up and
Yeah.
give into the internet or whatever. And that's kind of what I think, what I like about what you're trying to do, journals. You're trying to get people not only engaged, but to be proud of what we do as writers and why publishing books and reading and consuming books is a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, Professor, we are basically at the end of this interview. Is there anything you want to add before we close?
No, well, I'll just add, first of all, thank you for having me today, Germinal, and thank you also for your collaboration on this project. It was a delight for me, and it's been by far the best experience I've had
Thank
writing
you.
and
Thanks a
publishing
lot.
in my career. And I'm just delighted that we're both on the surfboard riding the wave and with Amazon, and we're going to see how the Wars of Israel continues to ride the rankings and hopefully go up the rankings. But anyhow, thank you for having me, and I look forward to meeting you in person at some point, hopefully
Absolutely.
in the near future.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Professor Kurt Jefferson. He wrote The Wars of Israel, Politics, Economics, and Security before October 7, 2023 and beyond. This is a 443-page book. It is pretty heavy, I gotta say, but the writing is absolutely understandable, very straightforward, and digestible. This book is available on the GGV Publishing website and on Amazon for anyone who wants to buy. I will also add the link of the book to this episode so that people who watch this episode can directly purchase the book if they're interested. They should be interested anyways. That's why they're watching the episode. But Professor, thank you very much for accepting to come on the GGV Publishing Podcast. I'm very grateful for having you. Thank you.
Thank you, Germinal.
All right, guys, it was Germinal Van, your host for the GGV Publishing Podcast. I'll see you guys next time.